And welcome to My Community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. Once again, we begin with a grateful heart. We thank Sir David Seal and the folks of the People's Market for their continued support and commitment to the production of this series, My Community. This week, we journey back to a defining moment in Barbadian history, the Great Hurricane of 1831. This catastrophic storm swept across the island, forever altering lives, landscapes, and the community spirit that defines Barbados. Entire communities were destroyed, crops wiped out, and countless lives lost. But from this devastation emerged a resilient people who, through hardship, found strength and unity. This hurricane was more than a natural disaster. It forged a shared identity and a profound commitment to rebuilding and supporting one another. Today, we remember the Great Hurricane of 1831 not only as an event of immense loss, but also as a testament to the courage and endurance that remain a cornerstone of our community's history. Well, while this series typically features personal accounts from community members, the Great Hurricane of 1831 occurred a long time ago. Therefore, to bring its impact to life, Dr. Henderson Carter, along with his colleagues and students, conducted extensive research, and they will now present first-hand accounts of the events as recorded in historical sources. We'll start by setting the stage, looking back at a few other major hurricanes that have struck our communities to put the magnitude of the 1831's disaster into perspective.
The word hurricane is an Amerindian word. It was the Amerindians who gave this phenomena of high winds are very destructive, the name hurricane. Obviously, the Amerindians were the first people who lived in this part of the world, which Europeans named the Caribbean or the West Indies.
On the night of August 10th, 1831, enslaved blacks, their masters, colored people went to sleep feeling that they were safe and sound. Some people, however, saw the storm clouds in the early evening. By 9 and 10 o'clock, the rain started to pelt down, as we say in Barbados. And by 9 a.m. the next morning, Barbados had been devastated in what we now call the Great Hurricane of 1831. That hurricane was not the first.
Barbadians have this idea, this saying that God is a Bajan. And because of this, they said that because he's resident here, that's why the hurricanes don't really pass or affect us. But this is not the case, because as early as the 1600s, we saw reference to different hurricanes coming.
Our first big hurricane was 1675.
So when I look at the record, what I saw is persons mentioning that the houses, they fall. We had cases with people dying in houses. We had cases with the vegetation being ripped up completely.
A hurricane that killed several people. In fact, in the Scotland district, that hurricane killed 17 people in one house.
There is a plantation called Walcott's in St. Andrew, and you know how the lands in St. Andrew shift. And it is said that when they went to bed that night, you know, we could sleep and rain falling, man. And that's it, right? And during the night, this overseer got up his family or the manager, and they barely escaped the house, right? And ran into some other buildings across the yard. Next morning, when they surveyed the place after the hurricane had passed, and hurricanes they like to come at night. I don't know why, right? And when they surveyed the lands, all the crops and coconut trees that was on their plantation was all the way down the road, miles away. The land shifted from what they report. It looked like the thing didn't get toppled up. It just slid down the hill. You know how you see landslides on television? So everything just shifted down to the next plantation. So you could understand how nature works and the strength of nature that we are no challenge for, you know? So you have to respect it.
The church at St. John, the St. John's Parish Church, that was blown down.
And this was not a one-off incident, because in 1695, this happened again, and actually destroying the country completely, the crops and houses and so on.
And then we fast forward to 1780, another great hurricane. This hurricane killed over 4,300 persons, many of them enslaved blacks.
The distraction from it was insurmountable, in the sense that there has so much great devastation that people could not describe how bad it was, and they spoke about it for generations on.
One of the things that we want to remember about the 1780 hurricane is that was one of the most devastating hurricanes, not only in Barbados, but actually in the region. It was the equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane. It probably killed upwards of 5,000 people in one fell swoop on the island in October 10th. Of 1780. And that really kind of spelled the type of disaster that was going to come another half a century later with the 1831 hurricane. But I just want to take us to that moment in 1780, because that at that moment had changed so much about what we know of the island today. So that hurricane in 1780 destroyed, it had about 200-mile-per-hour winds. It almost destroyed the entire island. It obviously had very much personal devastation to families, obviously to individuals, and not only the deaths that were involved, but the kinds of crushing events that often happen in hurricanes when buildings, fragile buildings, fall down. So people get have to suffer amputations, and that can often spell either disability or often death for those who kind of venture for shelter in a hurricane, but also they might leave their shelter thinking that the worst has passed, and it hasn't. So those are the same threats that we caution against today. So the 1780 hurricane is particularly significant from a heritage perspective because it not only destroyed a lot of buildings, but also destroyed a lot of the objects on the island. So a lot of the archives and objects, so the furniture, the kinds of things that people keep in their household, we don't have a very good record of all of those types of objects, especially locally made furniture, traditional craftsmanship, before that 1780 hurricane, because most of it was destroyed. Right? So you can talk about the human loss, but you can also talk about the cultural loss as well.
And then, of course, we come another 60 years later to the Great Hurricane of 1831, killing over 1,500 enslaved people. Some people say over 2,000. And then another 60 years, we come to the 1898 hurricane. This hurricane was not as devastating, but many deaths, lots of damage. And then another 60 years or so to Hurricane Janet, which many people could remember.
I'm old enough that I was 11 years old when Hurricane Janet struck. And this was a dramatic event because we woke in the morning to be told that the radiofusion had come on and informed everyone that there was going to be a hurricane. Now, my father was the parochial treasurer for the parish of St. John, and we lived on the border of St. George. His offices were next to what was called the almshouse then, the infirmary. And he had to drive from Ashbury 5 miles up to St. John to put his office in shape, as it were, to shut all the window shutters, to make everything safe, put away all the documents, make sure that nothing got blown away in the hurricane. And then he came home, and he got home by about 9:30, and my brother John and I were handing him nails while he was on a ladder, nailing down the shutters to protect the windows from the hurricane damage. And we lived in a house which looked out onto the east and onto the west. And we left a window open on each side so that we could see what was happening. And we watched as the winds blew and the rain fell, and we saw cabbage palm trees which were 50 to 100 feet tall being blown down. And when the first cabbage palm tree went to the ground, I mean, it's swung like this, and then wham, onto the ground, breaking at the bottom, very close to the bottom. My father said, "Okay, shut the windows up." Meanwhile, there was a wing, the kitchen wing at the back of the house. And that kitchen wing was a long wing with galvanized sheets of roof on it. And just before we shut the window, someone said, "Look, look, look." And the sheets of galvanized were peeling off the roof like the banana skin when you peel a banana. It was amazing to watch this effect.
Professor Sir Henry Fraser's vivid memories of Hurricane Janet and its lasting impact. Let's turn our attention now to other hurricanes and storms that have shaped our island's history. These events remind us of the powerful forces we've faced and the resilience our communities have shown time and time again. Here's a look back at some of the most significant storms that have tested and strengthened Barbados over the years.
But there was also Allen, almost Category 4 storm in 1980. We had Ivan, a little further off, but it was a major storm in 2004. We all remember Thomas, basically. Did not mature as a hurricane over Barbados, but did go on to be a hurricane across St. Lucia. And Matthew, of course, again, started off as a tropical cyclone across Barbados, moved into a tropical storm and developed into a hurricane as it moved across the Caribbean Sea. And then Elsa in 2021 became the first hurricane to directly move across Barbados in over 50 years.
And just a few weeks ago, Hurricane Beryl, we had a brush. And that tells us, therefore, that hurricanes have struck this island at about 60-year intervals.
There was a burst in the 1930s, 1933, when storms were recorded as far south as Trinidad, a hurricane. And then there was a burst in the 50s, and of course with Janet. And then there's a burst again late in the 60s. So it comes along. Yes, there's a cyclic nation. We might be a little bit over, but we just had Elsa, all right? And we're now having Beryl. And if you look at last year, while there were a lot of storms, not many of them were strong hurricanes that affected land. So I always warn, we need to look at these cycles, but my advice is always be cautious because all we need is one particular storm. If you remember, Andrew was only 1 or 2 storms that year, but still it was very deadly.
Even though we have been hit by great hurricanes, we have fought back. We've rebuilt the country, and it tells us, therefore, that we are resilient people, people who can fight back, a people who could build greater, and a people who could withstand all of these shocks, the shock of hurricane, the shock of the slave trade, and the horror of the slave trade, the shock of slavery itself, the shock of the cholera epidemic of 1854, and now the shock of this great hurricane of 1831. Why was it called the Great Hurricane of 1831? This hurricane demolished our strongest buildings, like this one here, Codrington College. It demolished windmills. It demolished 7 churches. These are stone churches, not wooden churches, stone churches. The stone barracks at the garrison. It demolished the prison on Quarry Street. And of course, prisoners were allowed to come out. It demolished enslaved blacks' huts, the huts of enslaved blacks. It demolished trees. Barbados was in a state of desolation. And when people look back, people living back in 1831, when people look back at that hurricane and compare it with the 1780 hurricane, they say that the hurricane of 1831 was more vicious. And so today, in this episode, we want to take you back to those days of August 1831, when Barbadians dealt with one of the most fierce hurricanes ever to hit this island of ours.
You know, I am always grateful for those people who left records. They left the accounts of the events of the past, because across time these have become markers of information on which we can draw from to know about the things that happened before we got here. The hurricane that struck Barbados on the night of Wednesday, August the 10th into Thursday, August the 11th, was measured as an intense Category 4 hurricane. And it has been described in terms that communicate the terror and the horror that was experienced here on this island. This was evident in the post-hurricane headline of a New York newspaper called the Evening Post, which was published on Saturday, September the 3rd, 1831. And the chilling headline read, "Great Hurricane, Barbados in ruins, immense loss of lives." Now those 9 words in that headline spoke volumes to the devastation that Barbadians suffered as a result of this quote-unquote great hurricane. That article in the newspaper, the New York newspaper, reported the havoc that occurred as the hurricane passed over the island and the desolation, the ruin, and the death that resulted. Reports reveal that although the entire day of Wednesday, August the 10th was kind of gloomy and cloudy with some rain.
Imagine yourself back in that time looking for signs, trying to figure out what a particular wind change, the way that the skies looked. Some people talk about how the moon looks before a hurricane or a major hurricane, sometimes how the animals or insects move, but you really would not have had that time to prepare.
Unlike today, when forecasts provide early warnings to prepare for hurricanes, the people of 1831 faced the Great Hurricane without notice. Let's walk through the events of that fateful day, step by step, using historical records that allow us to vividly recreate the scene and understand the full impact of the storm.
So let's begin the day on August 10th of 1831. The morning of the month, the sun arose without a cloud in the sky and shone through an atmosphere of most translucent brightness. So you would have gotten up on the 10th having not a clue of what would have been expected only about 12 hours later. At 6 a.m., and again, as I said, the records are really good about this. At 6 a.m., the thermometer stood at 83 degrees, rather typical, a little warmer than he had the night before. By 8, it had rose to 85. By 10, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And a nice breeze, gentle breeze was blowing, so I can say that again, about 10, 20 knots. And then later on, there was a temporary calm, and the winds are coming out of the east-northeast. As this turn subsided, the calm winds, or most of the part, prevailed, interrupted by the occasional sudden puff of north to northeast winds. Now, I took particular notice of this north to northeast winds. Typically in Barbados, we get almost continuously easterly winds, maybe east-northeast. So when you start to get a little bit of a north-northeast winds, the meteorologist's ear should kind of start to perk up a little bit, okay? But it was still pretty much, rather much of a breeze. It wasn't anything really to write home about. Typically, by noon, the heat increased to 87, and then to the warmest part of the day, as we knew, about 2 o'clock, it was 88 degrees Fahrenheit. By this time, the weather was uncommonly sultry, humid. So it started to get what we call an influx of moisture. The temperature started to rise. It got to its peak at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A gentleman called Mr. Benjamin Gittins of the estate called Thumbs appeared to have some expectation. He observed at 2 p.m., and I said it got up warm, at 2 p.m. on the 10th, indications of the approaching bad weather, in which he surmised was confirmed by subsequent appearance. And at 6 o'clock that evening, he bade his Negroes not to leave their homes. He was sure that a dreadful storm was approaching. At 4, the mercury sank to 86. Until that hour, the observations of weather are well detailed, made at Bridgetown, which is, again, for me, a good, so I knew that Bridgetown was my center, so I could have used that. At 5 p.m., the writer, being about 1.5 miles to the northward part of town, remarked that the clouds gathering very densely to the north. The wind commenced to blow from the very fresh at the same point. A shower of rain presently fell and was succeeded by a sudden stillness, to which the solemnity was added by a dismal dark horizon. So this is 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Everything started to look dark. So we start off in the morning, nice northeast winds, dust breezed. Again, surmising, we started to get a north component by 10, and definitely by 4, we started getting that northeast component, and by 5, it's definitely north. They started to get a shower in Bridgetown, and the horizon starts to get at least one thunder lightning.
On the evening of the 10th of August, 1831, around 7 p.m., large clouds appeared in the northeastern part of the island. They were dark and ominous, and they quickly dissipated, and this continued until around 9 p.m. that evening. But a change came over the sky around 9 p.m. in that the sky became very, very bright, and there was a stillness in the air. This quickly changed around 10:30 p.m. when gusts of wind, rain, and lightning flashed through the skies of Barbados.
Today's technologies warn us about what is coming our way, and the meteorologists will make predictions. But during this early period, there were no warnings. Can you imagine that? People only knew what they were about to face when it actually happened, when it actually struck them. It was on the doorstep. They were like sitting ducks. And this lack of knowledge and time to prepare, because we got time to go to the supermarket, get stuff so that if something happens, board up our homes, none of that. They didn't have time for any of that. Notice of anything coming, and that knowledge should give them time to prepare. In the stories told of the hurricane, then like now, people took it lightly. And instead of preparing and hunkering down and waiting for the hurricane to pass, they were engaged in parties and dancing and singing and drinking. And so they were caught in the midst of the peril that took their lives, because a lot of people died as a result. One report told how people partied until the house in which they were partying fell down around them. As a result of people not seeming to take it seriously, many bodies were entombed in fallen structures across the island, and the fear was that the disease would result and add to the famine and the dire need of the people at that time. One writer who survived and was spending time with his uncle and cousins outside of Bridgetown told how the family had previously made plans to have people come over for dinner and, play games and that kind of thing, spend an evening together. And although the day was gloomy and rainy, they continued with their plans. But as the weather deteriorated, their guests called it a night and left about 10 o'clock or so. He told how they had gone to bed sometime after 10, and subsequent to that, they were startled by the thunder and lightning. They gathered in the sitting room, but the continued violence of the weather prompted them to escape to the cellar of the already ruined house. The house was beginning to collapse around them, so they decided to go into the cellar. Just before the ruin folded on itself is when they decided to go into the cellar.
And the hurricane intensified, the winds and rains intensified on the island. Not only were there gusts of wind and intense rain, but there was no thunder accompanying the lightning, which was unusual in Barbados.
And as we close this episode of the Great Hurricane of 1831, we've only just begun to uncover the impact this event had on our island's history and its people. The resilience shown in the aftermath of such devastation set a foundation for the spirit of community we cherish today. Join us next week at the same time as we recount the personal stories of survival and rebuilding, exploring how this tragedy transformed lives and shaped Barbadian communities for succeeding generations. This has been Mind Community. Please be good to yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors.